4 people are about to ride a rocket that has already shown signs of failure. On April 1st, they will launch toward deep space on a system that is years late, massively over budget, and already tested in ways that did not go as planned. The part that must protect them during the most violent moment of the mission has already behaved in a shocking way engineers did not expect. NASA says it is ready.
So today, April 1st, 2026, 6:35 p.m., NASA Space Launch System rocket lifted off the pad with 8.8 million pounds of thrust, carrying the Orion spacecraft and the Artemis II crew out to Earth orbit and beginning America's grand return.
But there is one critical truth they still have not said out loud. The one detail that defines how dangerous this mission really is, and if what they are holding back is worse than expected. What exactly are these 4 people walking into? The question NASA refused to answer. NASA engineers went quiet the moment the most frightening question was asked. It was just one simple sentence. What are the chances these 4 astronauts die? That was it. That was the question put directly to John Honeycutt during the March 12, 2026 Flight Readiness Review. Honeycutt is a 36-year NASA veteran and the chair of the Artemis II mission management team. He is the person whose entire job is to know exactly how safe this mission is before 4 human beings get on that rocket. This is the number that tells you how close this mission is to ending in fire. Instead, Honeycutt gave a vague, uncomfortable range that sounded like something nobody wanted to say out loud. He said that for brand new rockets on their very first flight, the failure rate can be as high as 1 in 2. 1 in 2 means half of all brand new rockets fail on their first attempt. Artemis II is not the first flight. It is the second. So the risk should have dropped by now. That is what anyone would expect. So what are the real odds? His answer was this: not as dangerous as 1 in 2, but also not as safe as 1 in 50. Somewhere in that wide, terrifying gap between the two. It tells you the risk is still serious, but it refuses to say how serious. Critics have thought about this and reached one conclusion. That is a warning. So where is the real number? Because it exists. NASA has already calculated it. They have internal risk documents, detailed models, probabilities for every failure scenario you can imagine. Fire, explosion, loss of control, failure to return, they know, but they chose not to tell you. Other missions had numbers. Before SpaceX Crew Dragon carried its first astronauts to the International Space Station in 2020, NASA publicly released the risk estimate: a 1 in 276 chance of losing the crew. Before Boeing Starliner flew its first crew to the International Space Station in 2024, that number was 1 in 295. Both numbers were public, so why not this time? NASA has done this before. During the Apollo program, NASA conducted a full internal risk assessment. The results were devastating. The calculated chance of successfully landing on the moon and returning safely was less than 5%. Leadership made a decision: do not release it. The NASA administrator at the time said that publishing those numbers could do irreparable harm to the mission, so they canceled the assessment. They buried it. So completely, so thoroughly that decades later not a single document from it has ever been recovered. Now it is happening again. But this time everyone knows there should be a number. And NASA is choosing silence. The Inspector General has already warned that missions like this could face serious problems at a rate of about 1 in 40. The Space Shuttle, across 135 flights over 30 years, had an actual loss of crew rate of approximately 1 in 67. The Inspector General is saying Artemis may be nearly twice as dangerous as the shuttle ever was. NASA will not confirm or deny it, and it gets worse. NASA's own risk modeling identified micrometeoroids as the single biggest threat to this mission. These are tiny pieces of rock and debris flying through space at tens of thousands of miles per hour. They cannot be seen, tracked, or avoided. And when Honeycutt was asked about them directly, he said, "I'm not sure we understand what they mean." The man running this mission said that. About the biggest risk on the mission. and they are launching anyway. NASA also set a formal rule for itself before this program ever began. The system must not fly if the chance of losing the crew is worse than 1 in 75. That was the requirement. So did they meet it? Here is what we know. NASA ran internal risk assessments, but they chose not to release them publicly, which means no one outside the agency can verify whether this mission actually meets NASA's own safety standard. They set the bar, then they hid the results. And in the middle of all this, there is a date. April 1st. 4 astronauts will climb into that spacecraft that day. They will trust every system, every decision made behind closed doors. But the one number that tells you how safe they really are has been kept from you. If the number was reassuring, why not say it? The refusal to answer that question was not the first warning sign on this mission. It wasn't even the second. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the beginning of a rocket that was already in trouble before it ever left the ground. The rocket that was supposed to launch in 2016. It was supposed to be ready in 2016. That was what NASA told Congress. That was what billions of dollars were allocated for. It finally launched in November 2022, 6 years late, and by that point, the cost had exploded from an original estimate of around $5 billion to well over $23 billion just to develop. Every single time this rocket lifts off, it costs more than most countries spend on their entire space program in a year. This is the rocket NASA is about to put 4 human beings on. The Space Launch System, SLS, is the most expensive rocket ever built. It was designed and contracted through a process that critics inside and outside NASA have described for years as broken. The Government Accountability Office flagged it repeatedly for cost overruns and schedule failures. NASA's own Inspector General called the per-launch cost unsustainable. So why is it still flying? Because it is the only rocket on Earth right now that can send people to the Moon. Space Starship is still in development and has suffered multiple catastrophic failures during testing. Blue Origin. New Glenn has reached orbit exactly once. Until one of those vehicles is ready and certified for human lunar flight, the SLS is the only option NASA has. That is not a position of strength. That is a hostage situation. And the people who fund this program know it. There is something else that makes this even harder to ignore. Humans have already been to the Moon. Apollo program did it in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Astronauts landed, walked on the surface, and came back safely. So the question people keep asking is simple. What happened? Why does it feel like we are starting over? The rocket that took them there was called the Saturn V. It worked. It carried humans all the way to the Moon and back. But that rocket is gone. The factories were shut down. The parts were no longer made. The engineers retired or passed away. The exact way it was built was never fully preserved in a way that could be restarted. So NASA is not continuing where it left off. It is rebuilding everything from scratch. New rocket, new systems, new problems. And this time the environment is different. More politics, more scrutiny, less room for failure. In early 2026, the Trump administration proposed retiring the SLS and Orion spacecraft after Artemis III, meaning Artemis II and Artemis III would be the last 2 flights before the entire system is discarded. The program that took over a decade to build and cost tens of billions of dollars would be canceled after 3 flights total. Think about what that does to the people making decisions about this launch. The pressure to fly is not just scientific. It is not just about the Moon. It is about survival. If Artemis II slips, if it delays again, if it gives critics another reason to pull funding, the entire program may not recover. China's space program has been advancing steadily during every year Artemis spent over budget and behind schedule. The race is real, and NASA is running it with a rocket it can barely afford to launch. Nearly 4 years passed between Artemis I and Artemis II. 4 years. SpaceX during that same period flew dozens of crewed missions, iterating and improving with each one. NASA flew 0. which means the teams building and launching this rocket cannot learn and improve the way you can only learn by doing it repeatedly. Every flight is still, in many ways, like starting over. One flight, 3.5 years ago, and now 4 people. Are they speaking as engineers? Or are they speaking as an agency that cannot afford to say anything else? Against that backdrop, the teams responsible for Artemis II began their final countdown. And almost immediately, something broke. The seal, the rollback, and the fix. Nobody tested. Before a rocket carries human beings, it goes through something called a wet dress rehearsal. This is a full test where engineers load the rocket with real fuel, real pressure, and real conditions, just without ignition. It is meant to expose hidden problems before launch day. For Artemis II, the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft went through this process twice. The second test looked clean. No major alarms, no obvious failures. On the surface, everything seemed ready, but engineers kept digging. And that was when they found something that should not have been there. In late February, a new problem appeared. Helium was not flowing properly through part of the rocket's upper stage. To understand how serious this is, you need to understand what helium does inside a rocket. Helium is not fuel, it does not burn. It does something just as important. It keeps the fuel system stable. It pushes propellant through the lines. It clears those lines of unwanted gases. It keeps pressure inside the tanks at the right level so the engines receive a steady flow. If helium does not flow correctly, the engines can starve. Pressure can drop. Fuel delivery can become unstable. In a rocket, that is not a small issue. That is a chain reaction. The problem was serious enough that NASA stopped everything. Launch dates in March were canceled. The rocket was rolled back from the launch pad into the massive building where it had been assembled. Inside, the investigation began. This was not a quick fix. Engineers had to treat it like a crime scene. They used X-ray scans to look inside the system. They recreated the failure in lab conditions. They traced the problem step by step. What they found was simple but deeply disturbing. A seal had shifted just enough to block part of the helium flow. Not completely, just enough to disrupt the system. Here is where it gets dangerous. That seal sits inside the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. This is the upper stage of the rocket. It is responsible for one of the most critical moments in the entire mission, the translunar injection burn. This is the moment when the rocket fires again in space and sends the crew toward the moon. Once that burn starts, there is no turning back. You are committed to leaving Earth. If something fails there, the crew is not just stuck. They are sent into deep space without a guaranteed way home, or the system fails violently during the burn itself. So engineers designed a fix. They tested it again and again. That sounds reassuring at first, but think about it carefully. If the fix was simple, why did it need repeated testing before they trusted it? What were they seeing that made them test it over and over? While all this was happening, another detail slipped by quietly. The flight termination system batteries were replaced. This system exists for one reason. If the rocket goes off course and threatens lives on the ground, it is destroyed mid-flight. That system needs power at all times. During earlier tests, those batteries were not in full condition. Now comes the decision that changes everything. After fixing the seal, NASA chose not to run another wet dress rehearsal. No final check under the same stress the rocket will face on launch day. Why? Because loading the rocket with super-cold fuel creates stress. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen are stored at extreme temperatures. Every time you load them, the metal contracts. The structure shifts slightly. Seals are tested under real pressure. NASA said they had already learned enough from earlier tests. So the first time this repaired seal experiences full stress again, it will be with 4 astronauts sitting on top of it. Critics have wondered why they are taking that risk. Well, because time is running out. Every day pushes the launch window closer to closing, and this program cannot afford more delays. Now understand what is flowing through that system. liquid hydrogen. This is the second coldest liquid used in industry. It is stored at -423 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, materials behave differently. They shrink, they become brittle. Small flaws turn into failures without warning. There is no sensor that says the seal is about to fail. There is only the moment it does. And when it does, it is already too late. This is not the first time NASA has faced a decision like this. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster began with a seal. Engineers had warned that the O-ring seals in the booster rockets could fail in cold weather. The morning of the launch was freezing. The seals were not tested for those conditions. Some engineers said, "Do not launch." Management overruled them. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart. The crew cabin separated and continued upward before falling back to Earth. The astronauts were alive during that fall. They had no way to escape. 7 people died. That disaster was caused by a known problem that was accepted. The seal was fixed and the rocket rolled back to the launch pad. But the seal was not the only thing on this mission that had already broken once and was flying again without a full solution in place. The most dangerous component on the entire spacecraft had also failed its first real test: the heat shield that already failed. When this mission ends, it does not end quietly. The crew will not just drift back to Earth. They will slam into the atmosphere at over 25,000 miles per hour. At that speed, air does not feel like air. It behaves like a solid wall. The spacecraft compresses it so violently that it turns into plasma. Temperatures rise to around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hotter than the surface of the sun. The only thing standing between the crew and that heat is the bottom layer of the Orion spacecraft, the heat shield. And the last time NASA tested it for real, it did not behave the way it was supposed to. During Artemis I test mission, the capsule returned safely. At least that is what the public believed at first. Months later, NASA revealed something very different. The heat shield came back damaged in a way that was never expected. This shield is made of a material called avcoat. It is designed to slowly burn away during re-entry, which is the moment a spacecraft comes back to Earth from space and hits the atmosphere at extreme speed. The capsule is moving so fast that the air in front of it is crushed and superheated. That heat can burn through metal. Without protection, the spacecraft and everyone inside it would be destroyed in seconds. The heat shield is what takes that heat. This process is controlled. The outer layer of the avcoat heat shield slowly burns and breaks away as the capsule pushes through the atmosphere. Small, thin layers of the material peel off in a steady and predictable way. And each layer carries heat away from the spacecraft, preventing that heat from reaching the structure and the crew inside. That is not what happened during Artemis I. Instead, large chunks broke off, pieces that left behind deep charred holes across the surface. Around 100 separate areas showed this kind of damage. So what caused it? The answer is not simple, but it is clear. During re-entry, Orion used something called a skip maneuver. This means the capsule dips into the atmosphere, then rises back out, then comes down again. It is meant to control speed and heat. But inside the heat shield, something unexpected happened. As the outer layer burned, gases built up inside the material. The avcoat was not letting those gases escape fast enough. Pressure built up beneath the surface. Then it broke. The material cracked from the inside and ejected solid pieces outward. Now here is the part that should stop you. NASA did not fully understand this during the flight or right after splashdown. The capsule landed in December 2022, and at first everything was described as a success. It took months of detailed inspection, lab testing, and internal analysis before engineers understood what actually caused the damage. By the time they confirmed the root cause in 2023 and into 2024 reports, the Artemis II capsule had already been built with the same heat shield design. They could not remove it. They could not replace it. So, what do you do when the only thing protecting your crew has already failed once? NASA did not redesign it. They changed the way the spacecraft comes back to Earth. Instead of using the same skip maneuver, they will bring it in at a steeper angle, a faster descent, less time exposed to peak heating. That is the fix. But does that solve the problem? Even experts inside NASA are not fully convinced. Charles Camarda, a former NASA astronaut and Columbia disaster investigator, has been very direct. He says NASA does not fully understand what happened. He says this new approach should have been tested on an uncrewed mission first. It was not. Another expert gave a risk estimate for failure, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 50. That is saying we do not know how safe this really is. Even those who support the mission admit something uncomfortable. The heat shield will crack again. That is expected. The question is not if it cracks. The question is how much. And what happens if it cracks too far? Under the avcoat layer there is another structure, a composite material. It is not designed to take the full heat of re-entry. It is a backup, a last layer that can survive for a short time, a very short time. Engineers call it the last line of defense. If the heat gets past the main shield, that is what is left between the crew and destruction. And there is more. During Artemis I, something else happened that was not widely discussed. The bolts that separate the crew module from the service module during descent were damaged by heat. 3 out of 4 showed melting and erosion. These bolts are critical. If they fail, the crew module may not separate cleanly. Recovery becomes uncertain. NASA added more protection around them for Artemis II, but this was not highlighted publicly. Now look at history. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster was also a heat shield failure. During launch, a piece of insulating foam broke off from the shuttle's external fuel tank. That foam was meant to protect the tank from extreme cold, but it came loose and struck the wing at high speed. It hit the leading edge and created a hole in the heat shield. NASA saw the strike on camera. They reviewed it. They analyzed the data and decided it was not a serious threat. 16 days later, during re-entry, superheated plasma entered through that hole. It destroyed the shuttle from the inside. 7 astronauts died. That failure began with damage that was visible, known, understood to some degree. And still it was accepted. Now we have a spacecraft that returned with 100 damaged points on its heat shield, a failure mode that was not predicted, a fix that has never been tested in real flight conditions, and a crew that will trust it anyway. The heat shield, the seal, the skipped verification test. Each one is a decision that can be individually defended. But there is more. Because in the days immediately following the flight readiness review that cleared this mission for launch, 3 more technical questions surfaced. The flags that appeared after the green light. The flight readiness review was supposed to be the finish line. Every major NASA human spaceflight mission goes through one. Teams from every department gather and go through every system, every component, every outstanding concern. They vote. If the vote is unanimous, the mission gets its official green light. The review is the moment NASA looks the world in the eye and says, "We checked everything. We are ready." On March 12, 2026, Artemis II got that green light. And then, in the same press conference where NASA announced the April 1st launch date, 3 separate technical problems were disclosed. Back to back. They were presented as minor housekeeping items on the way to launch. The first one involves how the rocket steers. The Space Launch System does not fly straight on its own. It constantly corrects its direction during flight. This is done using something called thrust vector control. The engines can move slightly. They tilt. That tilt changes the direction of the thrust. That is how the rocket stays on course. This system is controlled by devices called actuators. Now here is the problem. Unusual data was found in actuators that were meant for a future mission, Artemis III. But the same type of hardware is already installed on Artemis II. So NASA started checking the ones on this mission. Think about the timing. The anomaly was discovered on future equipment. The check on the current rocket only began after the mission had already been cleared to fly. That means this was not caught during the main review. It came after. And if something goes wrong in this system during flight, the rocket does not drift slightly off course, it loses control. During ascent or during the burn that sends the crew to the moon, loss of control is not survivable. Now the second issue, navigation. The upper stage of the rocket is built by United Launch Alliance. Inside it is a system called the Inertial Navigation System. This system tells the rocket exactly where it is and exactly where it is going. It tracks movement, speed, and direction without relying on external signals. During testing, one channel of the Inertial Navigation System showed unstable readings. This system has multiple channels that work together to track position and motion, so one channel giving inconsistent data is a serious warning sign. It did not completely fail, but it produced data that engineers could not fully trust. So what did engineers do? They used something called burn-in. This means they ran the hardware repeatedly in a controlled environment to stress it and force any weak electronic components to fail early. After this process, the system appeared stable again, and NASA accepted it for flight. But understand what that means. Burn-in is not a true fix. It does not remove the root cause. It only reduces the chance of early failure. It is a way of exposing hidden problems, not eliminating them. It is an admission that the system had a reliability concern. And this system controls the translunar injection burn. That is the moment the crew leaves Earth for 8 days. That burn has to be exact. If the angle is even slightly wrong, the error grows over distance. Over 250,000 miles, a tiny mistake becomes a massive miss. The spacecraft could miss the moon entirely, or enter a path it cannot escape from with the fuel available. During earlier full launch tests, there were communication problems between the rocket and ground control. In one of the wet dress rehearsals, the Launch Control Center actually lost contact temporarily with systems on the ground side of the mission. NASA said this issue was identified and teams worked through it during the test, meaning communication was restored and the rehearsal continued. But they did not clearly confirm that the root cause was permanently fixed for flight. During launch, everything depends on clear communication. If an engine behaves unexpectedly, if the rocket starts to drift, if something breaks, the crew and mission control must talk instantly. Even a short loss of communication at the wrong moment can delay a critical decision. NASA said they were working through the issue. Working through does not mean fully solved. It means the problem appeared, it was managed during testing, but there is no clear public confirmation that it cannot happen again. So if the review is supposed to catch everything, why are new problems still appearing after it is done? 126 days of mission simulations, thousands of engineers, a unanimous flight readiness review vote, and a crew that heard every word of it, the heat shield, the seal, the skipped test, the unanswered risk question, and made their decision anyway. 4 people who know more about what is wrong with this mission than anyone watching from the ground. And on April 1st, they are going to get in. The Artemis II crew. 4 people are going to sit on top of that rocket, not test dummies, not names on a screen, real people. Reed Wiseman, 50 years old, mission commander. Victor Glover, 49, pilot, a father of 4 daughters. Christina Koch, mission specialist. She will become the first woman to travel that far from Earth. Jeremy Hansen, also 50, first non-American to go beyond low Earth orbit, first time leaving Earth at all. Their mission is not to land on the moon, not yet. Their job is to go there and come back alive. NASA needs to know if the rocket, the spacecraft, and every system aboard can actually survive the full journey to the moon and back with real people inside. Artemis II is that proof. If it works, NASA moves forward. Artemis III lands on the lunar surface. Humans walk on the moon for the first time since 1972. A permanent base at the moon's south pole becomes possible. The entire future of American deep space exploration moves forward. If it does not work, none of that happens. These 4 people are the test, and they know this. They sat in the review, they heard everything you just heard. The heat shield, the seal, the skipped test, the unanswered risk. And then they went home. Reed Wiseman went home to his daughters. He is a widower. His wife died of cancer in 2020. He raised his 2 girls alone. Before this mission, he took them for a walk, and he told them where the will is, where the documents are, what happens if he does not come back. Think about that. A father explaining death to his children, not as a possibility in the distant future, but as something that could happen in days. Jeremy Hansen did the same. He told his son and his twin daughters something very simple and very hard. We will probably come back safe, but there is a chance we will not. And you will have to keep going if that happens. Victor Glover has 4 daughters, late teens, early 20s. He has said he prepares them as much as NASA prepares him. Christina Koch has a simple way of looking at it. She says, do what scares you. But this is not normal fear. This is sitting inside a spacecraft that will leave Earth completely. At one point, they will go behind the moon. For 45 minutes, they will lose all communication with Earth. No signal, no voice, no help. Just silence. They will be completely alone, farther than any human has traveled in over 50 years. And then comes the moment that matters most. The burn that sends them there. Translunar injection. Wiseman described it clearly. This is not just a system check, this is a crew decision. They sit together and ask one question: are we ready to leave Earth? Because once that engine fires, there is no turning back. They train for everything. Fire in the cabin, loss of pressure, navigation failure, medical emergencies. 126 days of simulations. But there is one thing they cannot simulate: what it feels like when something starts going wrong and you are 250,000 miles from home. There is no training for that. And there is something else they know. There are moments during launch where they cannot escape. The launch abort system can pull them away from the rocket, but only within certain conditions. At certain speeds and certain heights, if something breaks, there is nothing to activate. They know exactly when those moments happen. They have trained for them. They have accepted them. NASA stood at that podium on March 12th and said everything was ready. They announced a launch date. They described their fixes. They listed their preparations. And when asked the one question that cut through all of it, what are the odds? They chose their words very carefully. Because here is what those words were actually saying. What NASA is not saying and why. Critics who have studied this program closely say NASA is not hiding one single secret. What they are doing, according to those critics, is something more systematic and more troubling than that. They are making a series of decisions that each look reasonable on their own. But when you line them all up together, they describe an agency flying a mission it cannot fully characterize. Under pressure, it will not acknowledge. Past a risk number, it will not say out loud. John Honeycutt, the chair of the Artemis II mission management team, said it himself almost accidentally. He said that when you develop a probabilistic risk assessment, it might scare you. A quiet admission that the numbers exist, that someone has seen them, and that you have not been shown them because they might scare you. That is the most honest sentence spoken in this entire campaign. Before Challenger, NASA's internal risk estimate was 1 in 100. Engineers who actually built the hardware calculated the real failure risk at closer to 1 in 35. The gap between those two numbers, between what the institution believed and what the evidence showed, cost 7 lives. The same pattern appeared before Columbia, 7 more. NASA has now set a formal safety requirement for Artemis and declined to publicly release whether this mission meets it. Reed Wiseman, the commander of this mission, said something recently that stops you cold. He said he tries hard to remind people that humans are not exceptional beings, that humans are sometimes careless, sometimes foolish, and sometimes make the wrong decision. The commander said that about the people who built the rocket he is about to fly. He knows. And on April 1st, April Fool's Day, he and 3 other people are going to climb on top of a rocket that has flown exactly once, carrying a heat shield that already failed its first test. cleared by a review that refused to answer the most important question anyone asked. If the true level of risk supports this mission, why not say it clearly? Why not give the number? That is what is not being said. And that is what stays with you when everything else is stripped away.